Welcome, future viewers, and thanks for watching all the way to the end. Or for skipping to the end to see my final thoughts on Shining Force, that's fine too. Shining Force is a great example of how far presentation can carry a game. It's amazing how well the artwork holds up. The character portraits, the battle art, the spells all still look good. Granted, 2 frames of animation for most attacks is a bit sparse, but the memory restrictions of the time make what we did get kind of a minor miracle. I have to admit that Shining Force is not the first game in the series that I played. That would be Shining Force 2, so it did feel like I was moving back a step in some ways. One doesn't make the other obsolete, though. There are certain elements in the original that I wish were still in later games. The feel of the original towns was never really recaptured again, and I got the impression that they were trying to aim for a slightly more mature feel in later games. I say give me more towns where the weird and silly things are all over the place. It doesn't strike me as unrealistic at all, because in real life people are weird and silly. They just work really hard to hide it most of the time. All of this is very important because, writing-wise, the story is simple, stock JRPG stuff that doesn't really stand out at all. The NPCs and general flavor of towns easily make up for all that. The town videos were my favorite ones to record and talk about. I'm certain I missed some things even though I tried to be thorough. What gets me the most is not really the quirkiness of the towns, although that has gotten some laughs from me. Instead it's kind of tough for me to describe, but the best I can put it is that everyone is very upfront and honest about what they want. But instead of coming off as selfish, it's more like they're just following their dreams and not being ashamed of whatever those dreams might be. Well, maybe I'm reading a bit too much into that. It could be just my own wishful thinking at work. And, of course, not all NPCs are the same. But still, I enjoyed all of the town sequences a great deal. It says a lot that the old inventors, Kokichi and Dr. Croc, seem like some of the most idealistic people you'll ever meet. The whole setting has kind of a decency to it. The closest you get to anyone ever being mean-spirited is the knights at the start of the game who say they can defend the town a lot better than you can. Well, discounting the monsters, of course. I think this is the only RPG setting that I wouldn't mind living in. Especially because Shining Force is a lot kinder to its townsfolk than some other games I can think of that love killing off large sections of the populace. I appreciate games where preventing things like that is the whole point of the game, and you can succeed at it. That's pretty nice. When it comes to game mechanics, I get the impression that you're not supposed to think too hard about what you're doing. I say this because there's no attack forecasts, things like evasion aren't explained or displayed, turn order is randomized and hidden, and anyone except Max dying is no big deal. This isn't to say there's no challenge. I almost got stuck because of a bad strategic decision after all. But most of the challenge is on making sure experience goes to the right people, rather than on winning any particular battle, except maybe the last 3 or 4 maps. Something unique to Shining Force 1 is the relative power of mages. They don't dominate every battle, but there are some fights where they make a huge difference. I think that's how it should be. It's okay for mages to be really flashy and powerful sometimes. Then the devs said, we're not doing that ever again, and magic was weakened a lot for later games. But that's another story. Another thing that they never did again was maps full of passive enemies, which happened way too much in Shining Force 1. So they were at least correct to fix that. Let's talk about what's next. There are a couple of games that might be a good follow-up for this one. We could play the direct sequel to Shining Force. Or we could play Shining Force 2. I should explain. In 1992, Sega produced a follow-up called Shining Force Gaiden on the Game Gear, but this game was never released in the West. It took place 20 years after Shining Force 1 and has a lot of connections with characters from that game. This side story also had a sequel called Shining Force: The Sword of Hajia, and these two games were later remade as a Sega CD compilation called, well, Shining Force CD. This version, which came out in 1994 and was released in the West, follows the Game Gear format very closely, but improved the production values, especially the music. If we're going to play through the story, I'm going to use Shining Force CD, and not just because it looks and sounds a lot nicer. The Game Gear version of Sword of Hajia had a nasty bug which made one of the spells a lot more powerful than it should have been. There is one thing that they followed a bit too closely though. There are no town sequences to speak of. You get what's essentially a between-battle menu where you manage your party and gear. This is understandable for the Game Gear version. I imagine hardware constraints were a big problem. But for the Sega CD, I think they should have added something. You already know my opinion on Shining Force Towns. Shining Force 2 came out for the Genesis in 1993. Set in the same world, but with quite a bit of time separating it story-wise, this game further expands on the game mechanics of its Game Gear predecessor with some new features. I won't go over all of them right here, but the biggest one is the introduction of items that can change what class you promote to. Map design of both this and Shining Force CD are much less frustrating than the original, not that this is a difficult bar to clear. Shining Force 2 has towns, and there are some funny things to find, but as I said earlier, they try to be more grounded than the original. I can see why they might do that, but I'm not a fan. Still better than no towns, though. So, 2 games, each of which could claim to be next in line. Last time I put Final Party Composition to a vote. Unfortunately, the structure of Shining Force didn't really let me do that, so this time the viewers will decide which game comes next. Will we look at how things turned out for some of our original characters, or will we move in a new direction? Let me know what you want in the comments. Whichever game we start next, I'll see you there.